Hello again, this is John Shada. I want to use the scale in front of me again today to continue my demonstration of how we see Old Covenant justice versus New Covenant justice. The Old Covenant justice was a legal justice typified by a balanced scale. You see the scale in front of me here, it's balanced in that, the offense, there's the offense, and there's the forgiveness of sin. That brings a balanced scale. But see, that would be the way Old Covenant justice would appear. There was the requirements of the law, the old, like the Ten Commandments, and the people tried to keep the Ten Commandments out of their own efforts, but that was powerless. So God added a sacrificial system where they could bring an animal and offer the blood of an innocent animal. And that brought about forgiveness of their sin, but it was temporary. And like you notice the scale jumping around there, shows how vulnerable that condition that they lived in. They were easily accused by the enemy. They still carried shame and guilt. Their consciences were not cleansed. And they could not enter into the presence of the Lord because the power, there wasn't the power in the animal sacrifices to cleanse the conscience or do away with the shame and guilt and the animosity that was connected with the sin. And therefore they were not able to come into the presence of the Lord because they were not totally cleansed themselves, purified. But New Covenant justice is quite different, and we've already talked about how that the offense was dealt with by the cross, and how the cross not only met the requirements of the law, but it exceeded them greatly. It was a weightier payment that bottoms out the scale. That shows us a picture of New Covenant justice. New Covenant justice is not about a balanced scale. It's not about getting even. It's not about the eye for eye and tooth for tooth. It greatly surpasses it. It's weightier. It actually puts this law system out of commission. The fact that the scale doesn't move represents the law being put out of commission by the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. So you may have seen my first video on this, but if you didn't, I was telling my own story about how I thought I had been applying the cross, but the Lord showed me I had not been applying the cross correctly. Whenever I was offended, I would forgive people, and thinking that was really all I needed to do. The Lord showed me that forgiveness alone is not the full application of the cross. I needed to exceed that, just as the cross exceeded the legal requirements of the law. I needed to add grace and undeserved kindness to my forgiveness. So the one who offended me, not only did I have to forgive them, but as grace is a gift, right? Grace cannot be required, cannot be earned, cannot be worked for, cannot be stolen. It has to be given as a gift. So I believe grace is optional for the New Covenant believer. We can choose to live in the law if we want to. That might sound pretty radical of an idea, but I'm just going by my experience. I feel like the Lord showed me this because I'd been good at forgiving people when they did something wrong against me, but I had not been good at adding the grace and undeserved kindness and blessing. Because of that, I lived here. And this moving scale represents how easy it is for the enemy to harass and condemn. He harassed and condemned me for my faults and for my failings. And I didn't understand how he was getting access to me as a new covenant believer. I'm thinking, I'm doing what's right. I'm forgiving people. I'm paying my tithe. I'm a regular churchgoer and all this stuff, but I'm still living like I'm under the law. And the reason was because I withheld the full value of the full weightiness of the cross. Jesus said, if you truly want to be my disciples, you have to take up your cross daily and follow me. So taking up the cross is partly for the purpose of dealing with offenses, so we can apply it to our everyday life. When someone comes along and does something to harm us, mistreats us in any way, we don't just forgive them, but we add the undeserved blessing of grace. And so how do you actually do that? Well, Jesus said, bless those who curse you, do good to those who mistreat you, and pray for those who wrong you. And so I had a good habit of forgiving people. I wasn't seeking any kind of judgment against them. I wasn't condemning them, but I just hadn't been praying for them or blessing them at all. I thought forgiveness was all I really needed to do, but I thought this undeserved kindness was just something God gave me. But man, was I wrong. I needed to give it away to others in order for me to live in it myself. It's kind of like trying to live your whole life on one paycheck. God gives us seed. I believe grace comes to us as seed. Some of it is bread and some of it is seed. Like he gives bread for food and seed to sow. Well, I had been eating the bread and the seed. I had not been sowing any seed of grace into undeserving people. So every time an offense came my way, I didn't recognize it as a good investment opportunity. I looked at it as another pain in the neck, because I would do my best to forgive the people, but I never saw it as an investment opportunity. So once I started seeing those things as an investment opportunity, I would say, okay, I can sow some seeds of grace now, and I can reap a harvest. And what I reap is more grace. And so I realized before, every time I would repent of my sin, and I would forgive people of their sin against me, I'd be good for a while. But I always had to deal with the hurt and the pain of the past, remembering the sin, remembering the incident. The enemy would use that to harass and condemn me. And it's because I hadn't been putting this law system out of commission by adding grace. When the cross is put on the scale, we saw that earlier, when the cross is put on the scale, the payment of Jesus Christ decommissioned the scale. It added grace. This wasn't just forgiveness, but there was grace, which is an empowering favor. So I had been living here. I had only been applying one little portion of the cross. I hadn't been applying the full value of the cross. You might wonder, how could we apply the cross at all without getting full value out of it? Well, Paul talked about, he said in 1 1 Corinthians 1:17, he said, if I can come to you in preaching with human wisdom and tradition, I'm going to make the cross of Christ of no effect to you. He said, so that tells me that when we operate out of human wisdom and understanding, which I was here, this was my human wisdom and understanding, was that the cross had forgiveness in it, which it does, but it has more than that. And I had made the cross ineffective because I was operating under my own understanding rather than having the understanding that I needed to sow undeserved kindness and blessing as seed into someone who offended me. God was giving me an investment opportunity, but I was overlooking it. He was giving me an opportunity to increase my grace, my measure of grace. And so, anyway, God doesn't want us to live here. He wants us to live in the full measure of grace. And so, Jesus told several illustrations. He says, if someone takes you to court, okay, here's the offense, that you're being taken to court, there's an injustice. He said, and the judge requires that you give your coat to settle the case. So I'll add that coat to the scale. We see that that's the requirement of the law. It met the judge said, give your coat. So I did what the judge said. Jesus said, don't just give your coat, give your shirt as well. So here we'll add that second garment. That's the cross. That's equal to the cross. The first garment is the law. That met the requirements of the law. But he said, I don't want you to live in the law. I want you to live in grace. And so in order to get into grace, you sow a seed of undeserved kindness, undeserved blessing. You give that second garment. In the same way, he said, if someone requires of you to go with them 1 mile, I'll use this garment again for illustration, 1 mile. He said, don't just be satisfied with meeting the requirement by going the 1 mile, go the 2nd mile. So here's the 2nd mile. It's the same thing again. It's an undeserved kindness added to the requirement. It's grace added to the law, what the law required. Grace never comes short of the law. Grace always exceeds the law. So, so the law brought about forgiveness. When the animal sacrifices were offered for the sins of the people during the Old Covenant, they were forgiven, but there was no grace in those animal sacrifices. And so I found that I was reducing the effectiveness of the cross of Christ by not applying the full weightiness of the cross. So when I learned that I needed to add the undeserved blessing by prayer, pray for those who bless those who curse you, pray for those who misuse you, and do good to those who harm you. And so I had not been doing that, but once I started doing that, I found that the enemy's power was broken because the weightiness, the weight was put on the scale that disempowered the devil, and it took that this weapon out of his hands when I added the extra weight of the grace, the undeserved kindness and blessing to the one who offended me. So anyway, there's something for you to think about today. Be blessed. We'll talk again later on.